After 27 years, his head was high and his fist was clenched. Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison today like a chief of state, flanked by his first lady and by the men who'd been hired to protect him. There they were, the South African State Police, providing security for the man who'd once been the most wanted man in Africa. The ANC flag...
That was February 11th, 1990. 60 Minutes correspondent Bob Simon was in South Africa on that historic day when Nelson Mandela left Victor Verster prison. Welcome back to CBS This Morning.
Bob Simon is with us this morning as we remember Nelson Mandela. He also covered Mandela's election as South Africa's first president under democratic rule.
Also here in Studio 57, former Time magazine managing editor Richard Stengel. He wrote the biography, Mandela's Way, and collaborated with Mandela on his autobiography. Stengel also wrote Mandela's obituary for a commemorative edition of Time magazine. It is online now and on newsstands Monday.
We also have South African-born poet and novelist Yvette Christianse. She is a professor of English and African Studies at Barnard College. But first, Mandela reflects on his life as a grandfather in our 1993 interview from our PBS program. Do you love your country more than you love anything?
Well, that is difficult. I've got a family, I've got children.
Yeah, but it's almost like you're married to your country, and destiny has made this marriage, and you have no choice.
It's inconceivable for me to love anybody more than my children and my grandchildren. I've got a grandson who is 4, who turned 4 in September. I asked him on his birthday, "What do you want me to buy for you?" He said, "I want a motor car." I said, "Let's go to the shops." We went. We got out of the car. He was holding my hand, my left hand. And we went to the shop which sells motor cars. But as we walked in, crowds milled round and they shook my hands. Now, he left this hand and came to grab this hand. Yes. So I said to him, "Well, can you hold this hand?" He said, "No." He held his hand because he saw me greeting other people with his hand. I stopped being his grandfather. I was now a grandfather of so many people he did not know. He was so upset that even when we entered the shop with vehicles, with motors, he was no longer interested. That is the type of experience we're having. A grandfather who is a grandfather not of my grandchild, but of the people around. It's a very painful experience, but nevertheless, we have to commit ourselves completely to the organization and to try to hope that your children and grandchildren will understand.
Bob Simon, Richard Stengel, and Yvette Christianse, I'm pleased to have each of you here. I should say that Rick Stengel deserved a lot of credit for that interview.
Well, Charlie, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm going to embarrass you on air, because as much as I love you, I loved your executive producer, Peter Kaplan,
exactly right,
even more, and I did that as a favor for Peter and for you. But what happened, what people don't know, is when he traveled abroad, he always stayed on South African time. So at that hour, it was the afternoon, and remember when he sat down in the chair, my heart sank because he went like this. And I thought, my God, Nelson Mandela is falling asleep at Charlie's interview. And then he did wake up, and then he had that very officious PR person who was looking at his watch and saying, "We have to finish," and he has to go. But it was a lovely personal interview, and you really brought out that side of him.
No, thank you for that tribute to Peter, too, because it was Peter's friendship with you that resulted in that. But Nelson Mandela, I mean, everybody's asking the same question. Who was this man? And what was his legacy? And we asked you to remember that, each of you, through your own personal observation, starting with you, Rick.
Well, his legacy, of course, is massive and worldwide and historic, but I did know him as a person. I remember him once saying that, you know, there are many, many people who love me from afar, but there are very few people who love me from up close. And that was one of the saddest things I think about his life, is that he lost that personal connection with the people he loved the most. And he was talking about that in your interview. But I do think the larger legacy for him is, you know, at a time when our own politics are parlous and perilous, he triumphed over and forgave people who imprisoned him for 27 years and took his life away and created a harmonious nation. And that's a lesson for all of us.
And Bob, you were there outside the prison after he had been released. 27 years in prison.
I was, and we'd been waiting for it for a week. It was a regularly scheduled event. We knew exactly what was going to happen. We knew how it was going to be choreographed. And these events are usually quite boring. Just because there are no surprises, we know exactly what's going to happen. But when he walked out, I just felt it in my gut. It was almost life-changing. We did not know who we were looking at. We did not know who he was. We hadn't seen a picture of him in 27 years.
Wow.
We hadn't heard a word from him in 27 years. We didn't know if we were going to see a man, a tottering old man who'd been broken by the apartheid thugs. We knew nothing, and it was only the next day at a news conference when he showed up, and he was poised and graceful and funny, and he called on the journalists who were the real apartheid journalists by their first names and laughed with them, that we thought, or I thought, you know, he just might be able to pull it off.
And Bob,
You know?
he was 71. That's what's so amazing. He was so strong and so tall when he walked out. He was 71.
The way to appreciate, for me, the way to appreciate who he was is not so much to listen to all the speeches we're going to be here in the next few weeks. Go to Robben Island
Yes.
and stand on that barren rock and look at Cape Town
Yes.
and stand there for a couple of hours and then try to imagine that you're there for 27 years and then try to imagine that you let loose after 27 years and you don't take every weapon you can summon and kill the people who sent you there.
And you say, I
That's
don't want
the
to be
amazing
bitter.
thing.
I want to be better. I want to talk to you, Yvette.
And he could have done it. That's the point.
He could have.
All he had to say when he
You're
got
right.
off Robben Island is, okay, boys, let's
Yes,
get
let's
him.
go.
And there would have been a bloodbath
And
of
they would have
unimaginable
followed.
proportions.
You tell the story as a young girl wearing a Mandela pin hidden inside your blazer. You had to hide it. Why?
That was in the 70s. The ANC was still banned. Images of Mandela would have meant that you were a supporter of the ANC and there would have been trouble. It was the era of buttons. Everybody's wearing buttons. And someone had sent us, I think from Swaziland, neighboring country where my family eventually ended up in exile. Somebody sent a button with a picture of Nelson Mandela, and my mom gave it to me. And she said, wear it on the inside of your school
And
blazer.
you can look at it. How do you think he changed the world's perception of South Africa?
I think, you know, you talk about that moment of him walking out of prison, and we who were not journalists, we saw him walking in that focused way that you gave us through the lens. And there was this man, it wasn't a cavalcade that whipped past, it was a man in a grey suit walking, smiling, waving, and it was the pace, the way that he walked, that just settled us all. We were joyous. I think it's the 11th of February, but in my mind it was Valentine's Day.
But people wanted to come to South Africa after that.
Yes, and, you know, he had been in our minds, in our backgrounds. He'd been the unspoken guest in some way, always.
Rick, one of the things as we talk about Nelson Mandela's grace, you do point out, because you spent so much time with him and wrote what is this really incredible autobiography, is that he was bitter, though.
Yes, so many people would say to me afterwards, it's unimaginable
And that's
that,
normal,
that he
yes.
didn't have anger in his heart and bitterness in his heart. And I would always smile inwardly because he was angry. He was bitter in so many ways. But what he understood and what he learned in prison was for him to become a leader of a united, non-racial South Africa, he had to hide every tiny vestige of that. He could never let anybody see it. He always had to wear the mask of forgiveness and reconciliation. He never let that drop. That was his great achievement. If he didn't feel it at all, then he would be a saint.
Yes.
He
It
wasn't a
wouldn't be
saint.
normal.
He had all that bitterness, but he realized he could never let anyone see it.
But what's so wonderful, Rick, is when we look at the pictures of the blacks and the whites outside of Nelson Mandela's home, arm in arm together. There was a story this morning about a white woman and her black maid who were sobbing uncontrollably, but both very happy to be there to pay respect.
Well, you know, there's that story.
Amazing.
I don't know if Bob knows it. The day he walked out, he walked out there, and then he was supposed to give a speech in the Grand Parade in Cape Town. He got in his BMW. They got lost on the way to the Grand Parade, and they ended up in Constantia, this beautiful, lovely, 100% white suburb. And they needed directions, and there was a young woman walking a baby in a pram. They stopped the car. Nelson Mandela got out to ask directions, but he said, "May I hold your baby?" He hadn't held a baby in 27 years.
Wow.
And so this was this fantastic story, and she was a very liberal woman, and she was obviously honored in this case, but what an astonishing event, just that little tiny thing that nobody knew about.
We must also remember that it was Nelson Mandela who saved the whites of South Africa, which is why the apartheid regime at a certain point realized they were lost. Sanctions had killed them, and their best hope for survival was Nelson Mandela because he was
That's what
the
De
wise
Klerk
man who
recognized.
could be the reconciliator. Anyone else, there would have been a civil war.
And yet, Yvette, it's important to know that South Africa is still struggling so much. 80% of the youth in South Africa unemployed. It's struggling. What do you think will happen now without Mandela?
I don't know. I think everybody's wondering. The hope is that we're all reminded of what he taught. I think there were two principles that he gave us. One was what I like to say is he asked us to give up the demand that Hamlet's ghost made, which is for revenge. And if you could give up that demand, even though you are angry, it's human and it's natural and it's healthy to be angry, you would orient yourself toward the future of a country you imagined. And for some of us, like my grandmother, she never saw it. She died without the right to vote. But I had the right to vote because of Mandela and everybody. I think the thing that we have to remember is he understood he had to have a good team around him.
Rick, how did he handle, after he left the presidency, all this adoration that he knew was his? With bemusement, with what?
No, he enjoyed it, Charlie. I mean, he enjoyed a certain percentage of it. I mean, in many ways, he was really the George Washington of South Africa. And not just because he was the father of the nation, but because he willingly stepped down from the presidency, which set a precedent for the rest of Africa. He liked the fact that he had gone back to the farm, a la George Washington, and that people feted him. But he also learned a lot even after he left office. I mean, he had not been very progressive about HIV and AIDS when he was president. Thabo Mbeki had made a number of mistakes. He learned all of that. He criticized Thabo after his presidency. So he still remained engaged until the last few years.
And let's remember that when people are comparing him to George Washington, of course, but at the same time, it's even more relevant, I think, to realize, and this is the sad part, that there's no one around today anywhere like him. If one wants to think of the last great politician, we're going back to the Second World War.
There's
been nobody like that, and there's nobody around today, which is just goes to show where our world has gone.
And Bob Simon, you have the last word on that. Very well put. We thank you all.